Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules in your afternoon to attend today's joint Glural-Siler webinar series featuring our guests today from US EPA's Research Triangle Park Office, John Iames and Ross Lunetta. John is a geospatial scientist with 17 years of geospatial analysis experience, looking primarily at air-water interfaces at multiple scales. He focuses on looking at the accuracy and error of remote sensing products and comparing that with in situ derived data. And he's currently the co-lead of a project that's looking at terrestrial remote sensing products within a multi-agency NASA-funded research project looking at cyanobacteria counts in freshwater aquatic systems. So that is John. Ross Lunetta is a senior research scientist, also at US EPA's Research Triangle Park Office, and by the way, both of them are within the National Exposure Research Laboratory. Ross has a broad range of experience, including being a Michigan native from the Bloomfield Hills area, and also worked in Detroit at the Army Corps office there for several years, currently with EPA. Looking at advanced systems, remote sensing systems, and spatial data analysis tools for better understanding landscape condition and particularly changes at watershed and regional scales. Also looking similar with what John is doing at integrating in situ water quality data with satellite-based products, all within the context of remote sensing derived data, spatially distributed landscape processes, and other initiatives. So without further ado, please help me welcoming Ross and John today, and we'll turn it over to them. Thank you guys for coming. So John, if you could just be sure to speak into the mic. We have several people on the webinar.
Will do. Thanks, Drew. So Drew goes back with our days at EPA when he did his postdoc there in Research Triangle, and we've kept up the relationship and appreciate the invite to come on out here and speak with you all. As you know, Ross went to Wayne State and Northern Michigan. I don't have the Midwestern roots. I don't really know all the different cities. This morning we spoke at the Corps of Engineers in Detroit, and I was trying to tell the group about this lake that was in Ohio, and I said it's somewhere between Cincinnati and Toledo, and they said that's the entire state. And so that's about my knowledge of where I am now. I know I'm in Ann Arbor. But today we would like to speak about a project. This project, it's a 5-year project that was initiated through NASA looking at cyanobacteria and in freshwater systems. Where we mostly focus, I know your group mostly focus on the Great Lakes. We're looking at the inland waters in particular. And this is driven by the fact that we're looking at using satellite data to track in near real time these blooms and allow the public to also have access to this information, and that's what this network is all about. And so previously, prior to this big grant, this 5-year grant, we had looked, Ross in particular with some of his colleagues, at Cyano, looking at the Mira satellite and doing some looking at the correlations there. This project is linked up with 4 agencies, NOAA being one, and NASA, USGS, and us at EPA. And so, quick disclaimer, and we'll move through that, quickly read. Oh, and for my own disclaimer, our role within this project is looking at the linkages, the environmental linkages for these cyano blooms. And Ross brings in particular his expertise in aquatic and marine and the cyano background. I bring in the terrestrial. I'm a forester by background, and so at times I may give it over to Ross for a few minutes, and he may say a few things if I miss something on some of these slides. But the first thing I want to do is just talk about, the main issues. As you well know, this audience is well informed about what's happening. But looking at the cyanobacteria, chlorophyll A, and turbidity, we want to be able to operationally monitor these using these techniques. Basically, we've been limited by the fact that it's been mostly in situ data that's been available to us. And there hasn't been much standardization, not easy to access the data. And you know, the overall goal for this project is not just for this to be a research entity, but to get this data and this information down to the end user, down to the management level also. And we'll talk about that. Oops. So what are they saying? Very good. So our goals are to basically get a standardization and to develop a cyano index to disseminate, to get this information system out, produced specifically by a satellite system. We want to be able to also, as I explained earlier, explore the connections, the linkages between health, economic, and environmental conditions to these blooms. At EPA, our role primarily is with human health and the environment, and so we're exploring those linkages. Whereas the other players in this USGS is really dealing with the algorithm development. Many of you know Rick Stumpf, and then with NOAA, being able to, actually NOAA develops the algorithms, USGS does the validation, and then us working on the health issues and the environmental connections. And NASA ultimately will disseminate the data once it's out. The benefit for what we're dealing with here is that we're able to access a large number of inland lakes, over 153,000. This is beneficial in the fact that in situ data only can access localized data, localized information, and we're able to now get this in a timely manner for the entire CONUS area. And so our questions, you know, looking at what are the environmental drivers that control the development of these cyano blooms. And I'll look later at the different variables that we're pulling together to look at the up lake watershed level areas and variables that might impact that. Which drivers give us the best predictive ability for both near and long-term bloom potential, and then, you know, what are the best management practices to mitigate these issues. So again, I mentioned that there are a number of different groups involved, and this flow chart basically shows the different groups. At EPA, we've got a number of different labs that are working together to deal with both the health impacts and the environmental impacts. We are, as an example, looking at the correlation, looking at hospital visits where bloom activity has happened. So we're trying to pull that information together. We're looking at environmental factors, the cost. You guys had that 2 years ago, that Toledo event. And so we're trying to figure out the environmental costs and factors to these bloom events too. And so again, I mentioned all the different players. Specifically, USGS has allowed, is doing the validation with the algorithm. They're also providing data for a Landsat 8 surface water temperature product, and so we're in the midst of validating that right now. And ultimately, we're looking at bringing in Sentinel-3 into the fold as far as getting these chlorophyll values. And so right now we have Landsat with USGS. So Landsat, we're looking at, for Landsat 8, the temperature product, and with Sentinel-3 and VIIRS, NOAA is looking at bringing that into the fold as far as the cyano counts. And what EPA is going to be doing is bringing that into a distribution mode and into a mobile app we'll talk about, as well as a website that distributes environmental data called the EPA's Enviro Atlas. And so this just gives there's a lot of players. As you know, when you get a lot of players, can be challenging for any type of science product, but to have 4 agencies, and this just gives a list of the number of people involved. The reason I wanted to bring this up is we've got a number of folks here in the Great Lakes area that we work with that you may be familiar with. We just met with the Corps of Engineers down in Detroit, and there was also a Corps of Engineers individual who was in Cincinnati that's also involved in this. And continue. Excuse me. There we go. So we mentioned earlier that we've already done some smaller studies to look at the ability of Maris to detect these blooms. And we initially worked in 3 different areas, and you can see that in one area is New England, another area is in Ohio, and lastly we worked in Florida and to look at these blooms. So the lake is in Ohio is St. Mary's. Are you all familiar with St. Mary's? That's what we looked at intensively. And Maris, the satellite Maris, has a temporal collect of every 2 days. So it's very, very fine scale in that manner. We get a lot of data. However, it's at a 300-meter resolution, so we're limited as far as the size of lakes that we can actually image and get information from. And so really the size of lakes we're looking at is at least a 15-hectare lake. Now, obviously the lake has to be the formation of that lake. If it's narrow, we're not going to be able to get a pixel in there. So we're really looking at a window of about a 3x3 Maris window with a single pixel that we can get from the middle. So that's why we're limited to 15 hectares and above for these lakes. The next slide shows the results of the Maris cell counts versus the in situ. We've got a lot of data in these areas, and you can see that there was a sign of binning or clumping that was going on within this data, and some good correlation. So we decided, instead of taking the individual values, to go ahead and bin them, and the binning produced basically a low, medium, high, and very high ranges for these different cell counts. And what we noticed is that this binning doesn't really correspond well to the World Health Organization definition of low, medium, and high and all those things. That's more of a random definition or designation for the different cell counts. And the problem is that there is what the satellite detects is more surface area versus what we just talked about earlier with the cell counts being in situ and collected that way. So it's kind of a little bit of apples and oranges as far as that goes. We've discussed a few of these slides. Do you have any input you want to make? Doing good? I'm excited. I'm getting back to the terrestrial here in a second. So as we pursue this, you can see the correspondence with the in situ data at these different binning levels. We get very good correspondence at the low and the very high, but in the middle, the medium and the high values, we definitely got more confusion. And again, we think this is in reference to the in situ data being more cell count versus the satellite data deriving more of a cell area or a cell volume or cell area. So our purpose, one of our other segments of this project, and we have some folks down in Athens, Georgia, who are developing a CYAN mobile application. Our intention is to push this data to the public so that they have access, at least on a weekly time step, to view where these blooms are occurring, and can be pushed definitely to the mobile app. Initially, we developed this through a particular vehicle, and it was initially developed to go to the Apple system. However, EPA changed that everything would be Android, so we lost that, so we had to go to Android. So we've been kind of going back and forth, but right now it's definitely in the Android world. And the way this works is that basically the user will be able to go in and get a graphic, pick out their lake of interest, and we'll have these different values of low, medium, high, or very high for the counts for that particular date. And we have this in beta form right now. And here again is the graphic. And so it'll give you obviously a geolocation. It'll also give you a visual of the lake itself and the distribution, the geographic distribution of the outbreaks, the cyano, and then it'll give you a time series too of what's happening. And so from a prior study that Ross had mentioned, they had looked at data from the St. Mary's Lake in Ohio, and you all are well aware enough that things definitely changed here, and this is from the MERIS satellite to be able to detect these cyano outbreaks. And this has been done for many people relating chlorophyll with with the actual in situ data. This has been done here, and it's done for the algorithm development for the MERIS satellite, and it's being done for Sentinel too. So I mentioned that the USGS, one of the important variables that obviously that goes into the development of these blooms is temperature, lake temperature, and the Landsat 8 is being developed for a surface temperature product by USGS right now. And we're in the midst of assessing that product. We've assessed it currently for the, this data right here is for basically center pixels within the middle of the lake. And we're waiting for data to come in and their information so I can go ahead and get the edge of lakes too. So we want to know that transitional area where it's part land, part lake, to see if that's also holding, because a lot of these blooms, obviously, as you know, extend over to those edge areas, and we want to make sure that those lake temperatures are also well correlated. And we're also applying this to the estuaries. So here are some of the ongoing efforts, and so we've got the algorithm, and we are a little bit, we just got the data in for the MERIS from 2002 to 2012, and we're beginning to, I'm going to show you some slides on that here in a minute, and the data will be publicly available. You're familiar with CDAS, it's a NOAA site, you guys, correct? Is that right? You guys are all in on that one? It's all new to me, but CDAS is one of the areas they're going to be storing this data and serving it out. But as mentioned, we've already looked at it regionally, and the Sentinel data is going to become available fairly soon with the Ocean Color Land Imager, that instrument with on that sensor, and that's also at 300 meters. And this is just an example of a couple of the lakes that we've looked at in California, and looking at the in situ data, which is on the bottom of the slide, and the MERIS data is up on the top, and looking at the distribution and trying to see how well the algorithm performs. Okay, so for this slide, the early results of the CYAN study is that the take-home message is, are the blooms, are they getting better or are they getting worse? And it's been a hard question to answer just with data that's sporadic or regional and everything else. You can look, people do many studies on a lake level basis, but what's it doing across the entire U.S.? And so we're hopefully taking this data and be able to look at it on an area basis and on a timely basis, see are they increasing. However, you can see that some of the lakes, like the one in the, if you look at the graph, I don't know if they can see this online, but this, no, you can't see that, but the top graph on the right, fairly flat line, fairly stable system. You would say that lake system is not changing that much. And a couple others show a general upward trend where it is actually changing. And so the difficulty with this and looking at an area base is that if you understand satellite data, you get atmospheric interference, and so if you're looking at one lake at one time period, it may be interfered, that one pixel, at a different time period. You may have some sediment issues that are coming up that are interfering with what you're getting back, and so it's not as easy as you may think that you're going to get the exact same number of pixels at every single date. And so we're working through these different challenges to try to make to look at these trends to see if we can make a statement on them. All right, looking at the area, Ross and I are here for 2 weeks. We're going up to, we're leaving here and going to Wisconsin tonight and starting really a robust look at some riparian buffers in both Wisconsin lakes that have been identified as culprits in the cyanobacteria world, both in the Minneapolis area and in Wisconsin. We've taken the Great Lakes Basin and expanded it so that we can include a lot of the western portions where North Dakota, South Dakota are, and also extended it through the middle of Vermont so we can catch Lake Champlain, which also has a number of cyanoblooms. So the goal here within the environmental aspect, looking at, can we look at causation or look at linkages, is first of all to identify the lakes with high cyano counts between these dates of 2002 to 2013. We're assembling variables, all kinds of environmental variables, which we'll look at here in a minute, at a grid level and also at a HUC level at these 14-digit HUCs. And we're looking at lakeshed linkages to possible smoking guns, so to speak. And so here are some fresh images from the data that we just got probably 2 weeks ago. And that's Lake Winnebago. That's the lake, one of the lakes we'll be looking at the next couple of days and looking at the lakeshed behind that. But you can see the orange and the red areas really indicate higher cyano counts for this 2008 date. And you can see the distribution, so obviously it's a lake that's impaired. And then looking at how it is distributed, the lake is, the lakeshed are all these 14-digit HUCs. So there's a number of them here within the unit. The reason we're living in the 14-digit HUC world is because it also conforms to the EnviroAtlas, which is the US EPA side of distributing this data. And so we are averaging also over the 14-digit HUC as well as using the original gridded data. And so I don't want to go into this great detail, just to know that nitrogen can be nasty, and as it gets in the system, it's just a good slide to have. And so all of us are fairly aware of the human side of nitrate and where it comes from. So obviously the ag side can be fairly large, and looking at different applications. Feedlots are a big one, and they're a difficult one to map out. If you go on, EPA back in 2007 was able to work with the USDA to get a county level count of constrained, what they constrained animal feedlots, contained animal feedlots, these CAFOs, and so they've got them listed at a county number, county level. And so this is the tricks of trying to work with this type of data. So how do you take the county, and you've got these, you may have 6 14-digit HUCs that represent that county, and how do you distribute that count throughout those 14-digit HUCs. Do you equally distribute it, or do you go in with finer tune, which is very difficult? And so there's a lot of learning here to how to get the best data in here. And so there's obviously all these other issues that are going on for sewage and lawns and parks and percolation. And so the CAFOs are a big deal, row crops obviously, and you can read these bullets on your own. Ag lands are primary source, and a lot of loading that can go on within these ag systems. Where my world comes in is we're looking in this research, and actually over the next 2 weeks, is really identifying the riparian buffers, and they can be very effective in removing nitrogen. And what we found is that the most effective buffers are ones that are a mixture of forested land and have a grass shrub understory. And so you don't want a buffer that's 100% canopy closure, because it shades out everything underneath, and so any storm event, large storm event, that overland flow is not going to be stopped. But if you have just a grass buffer, that's a good thing, but what's going to happen with that is it's just going to mat down over a big storm event. And so you need the mixture. What they've found, you need the mixture of both, kind of a 50% canopy, 30% canopy with that undergrowth, because the trees allow that rooting system for the waters to percolate on down and trap that, as well as the grass. And so we're going to be evaluating some of the buffers within this region, these lake sheds, to see their efficiency over this time period. And I think I just mentioned this. So they have to have all these different elements. And one thing too that is interesting about the buffer is that in North Carolina, there's a best management practice of having a 30-meter buffer on each side of a stream. Farmers are asked to go ahead and join that methodology. They don't have to, but others, developers, have to go ahead and do that. What we're finding too is that it may not be necessary to have that 30-meter along that whole extent, but there is the source nitrogen on an ag field, based on the flow lines as you go down through a digital elevation map, the entry point is where you really need to focus that, where the sink is, where that sink cell is. And so we believe that identifying these and seeing the expanse and how wide they may be at this level, may have to have a wider one at the expense of maybe narrowing it at some of the other areas. And so these are some of the questions we're looking at, and we'll be looking at that over the next 2 weeks too on these source sink areas. These are some of the variables that we're looking at. Right now I think we're up to up in the upper 70s, and we have variables that are using different hydrologic models, moving nitrogen across the surface, and we're getting what's called edge of field nitrogen at a pixel level, and that'll be implemented into this project too. And so we're doing a number of different things. We're going to model this at the HUC level, but also on a factorial basis using kind of the pixel level too. So it's kind of a dual thing to see what type of results we might be able to get.
John, as part of that activity, are you looking at also standard wetlands and riparian buffers as well? You mentioned forests and lands.
Yeah, yes.
Is there a lot of
Right. Wetlands will be included in that. Yes, sir. Yep. That's a good point. And I include that as a buffer, riparian. That's kind of my definition too. It goes beyond that. Yeah, that's a good point. So the question was, are wetlands also included within riparian buffers? And that's how we look at them too. So, in this, I shouldn't have put this slide up. And this is just a graphic of looking at the data now and looking at some of the higher levels of Like right here is the percent woody wetland within a 100-meter buffer, and you know, obviously that's a variable that is beneficial up to an extent, as we just talked about as far as the crown coverage. And these are the HUCs within this Great Lake Basin, just a section of it, and these are riparian slopes that are fairly steep, and you're going to get more extreme nitrogen possibly put into the system based on the slope. And then around your area here shows riparian canopy cover that's really low, so you're getting kind of the grass area or even 0%. And so you can see that Michigan has a lot of riparian buffer that's probably not meeting that perfect, you know, if you want to say perfect, characteristic of what would be helpful. So there's a lot of it there. So we're going to be getting into this and teasing this out. Again, we're in the first really 6 months of this project, and we're just now getting the data. So you're getting the initial stages of this. I think that's it. Okay, soil erosion, so greater than 30%. And that's all I have. Ross, do you have any last thing you'd like to say? Right. So I'm going to do something which is probably dumb, is try to go on the web and find this. Can I do this here? It's not minimizing. Once you pass that, yeah.
You mentioned a lot about nitrogen, but phosphorus is a real issue too, but is nitrogen your surrogate at this point?
No, phosphorus is in play. We're also tracking phosphorus, but great question. Yeah, I'm a...
The better way to think of that would be nutrient potential. So that'd be a better term to use. Yeah.
Any other questions while we get this? Is this frozen?
Oh, there we go. He's hiding over
Well,
there.
then how do I get
So
there?
in order for the webinar to see it needs to be on that screen.
So
So
how do
you'll
I see
have
it?
to
Like play with it
do
here?
like that, unfortunately.
Oh, wow, okay. Lyro, Alice. Okay. Okay, so this is a very good website for accumulating all these different environmental variables across the entire 48 states, and they have done a number of different data analysis that you can find here. And so this is one of the areas that our 14-digit HUC scale up will ultimately reside, as well as the mobile app. So I wanted to bring this up, and I'm going to go ahead and fire this up as we talk and see if I can actually find the map. It's somewhere in here. It's probably down here. Oh, here it
Just
is.
to say something while John's doing that, what this will do is not only be a repository for the data, but the landscape ecologists have developed numerous analytical tools that will be associated with this site. So you can go in and not only grab the data, but also do analyses. And this is going to migrate up to the Amazon cloud. So you'll be able to go in, access this, get data. You won't have to download it if you don't want. If the tool's there you need, you can do the analysis right up in the cloud and then download your products.
Yeah, so anyways, as this loads up, any other questions?
Yeah. One other complicating factor you should consider is the fact that the nitrogen cycle is closely interrelated with the trace metal cycles.
Mm-hmm.
You can have all the nitrogen in the world. If you don't have any of the essential trace elements, you're not going to get any blooms, right? And so I think when you are looking at what are some of these factors you use for correlating or predicting the blooms, I think you may also need to look at
Trace
the
metal.
distribution of some of the very essential trace metals.
Very good. No, that's a good point.
In fact, what I suspect personally is that in areas where you don't have adequate trace metals, you tend to have phenotypes that may be more toxic. Again, this is really a hypothesis that I'm trying to work on. We are trying to do something. Sorry, my name is Jerome Riaga. I'm in the School of Public Health, University of Michigan.
Very good. Thank you.
I just want to say, yeah, first of all, thank you for the talk as we continue, but let's take a moment to thank John for the talk.
You're welcome.
We have plenty of time for questions, so we can pass around the microphone for questions in the room. It's a great way to get them articulated, and there may be questions online as well. But the floor is open for questions or comments.
I have one more, and then I'm going to be quiet for a while. You're using at this point Rick Stump's standard CI index, his standard algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And for those in the audience that don't know the history, and it's great work, but the satellite, the ocean color satellites, gave us the bands. They're not necessarily optimum bands to detect blue-green algals. What we've done is, with Maris, a lot of good European work that Rick made better, essentially. We've taken those bands, same with our MODIS, same with VIRS, which is almost identical to MODIS, and we've created these indices and then related those to the in situ measurements. They are really, again, a surrogate. They're not truly blue-green. They're not truly harmful algal blooms. Now, what we've learned in the Great Lakes, Gary Fonesteel, that used to work here and is retired now, he's learned that these high chlorophylls, and that's really what the CI stump index is, that if you look at that, and then if the temperature is 18 degrees C or higher, then there's a high probability, at least in Ohio, western basin of Lake Erie, that these are going to be HABs. But there is a inference here. This is not, the CI is truly detecting these HABs. It's inferring, and again, if we have the temperature, that's why I commend you that you're working the temperature piece. I think as you get more mature, and if we do have water temperature, again, it's surface temperature, and there are issues with skin depth, as you pointed out, John, that the satellite is only looking at the upper surface of the lake, and we have to infer the volume part of it. But if we ignore all that, having temperature as a secondary value is going to make your predictions even better.
Perhaps.
And well, they will be better. But and then at some point you can think about false alarms, because I did see on your one plot you had blooms and it didn't look like a tract. It looked like you had a couple of false alarms, and I forgot, Wisconsin Data Center, one of them at that point. And I encourage you guys at some point to think about, we do a lot of work for the military. It's all about false alarms. They don't want us crying wolf, and I think you have to be careful as you move forward, popping up too many maps and scaring grandma and the kids.
That's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the things also that's part of this project is going to be a continuing validation effort. So there's going to be a number of validations set up across the United States, which will be based on existing long-term in situ sampling sites that are committed to continuing that activity going forward. So validation will be an ongoing thing with this project. So You can't have enough of it, obviously.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so
Sure.
there is a little bit of time for questions, but it sounds like maybe we have a question or two from the webinar. Nicole?
We have one question from Cody Black. Are you considering low nutrient water bodies when lakes are being fertilized?
Do you mind repeating the question?
Are we considering low nutrient bodies? Is that what you said? We're considering everything. We're going to be doing lakes that are impaired, that have a history of impairment, plus every lake that fits the criteria of 15 hectares or greater. So that's going to be low nutrient bodies, everything. Everything's going to be covered. Hopefully I answered that okay. That's what he's looking for.
Let's take time for one more question before we break, and folks can stay there for a question, so we'll do one more formal question, right?
Among inland lakes, is the relationship between your satellite signal and either chlorophyll A or cell count or whatever you're using consistent, or does it differ among lake types or depending on the landscape setting? Or have you looked at that kind of thing?
We're just getting the data in now, and so those things will be taken into account. That's a great question. I think we're gonna be looking for a localized issues and all those different things. And right now, before we came, I was just running just the basic stats on this Great Lakes area, the histograms for that to see the distribution and where they were. So we're really at this nascent stage of everything, but that's exactly where we're going to be going. Yeah. So catch us in 3 years, we'll come back or 2 years. We should say 1 year.
Yeah, just, this CI index that we're getting from NASA, they're the ones that are processing it using Rick's algorithm. So we just got the data for our initial study area. So we're not to even a version 1 product yet. For those people that are familiar with things like MODIS, where you have different versions, and I expect we'll have the same thing here, but we haven't declared V1 yet. And the other thing is, they are anticipating to get ocean land color imaging data coming in probably now about this time, some initial data sets to start working on that, because that's going to be the workhorse going forward, is the ocean land color imager. So NASA will be starting up with that as well, so we'll start ingesting that data.
So anyways, this is the Enviro Atlas. You can play around with it, but this is where the data will be housed at some point, and we'll be getting the HUC data up there as we're producing this. And as we mentioned, also the MERIS data will be available to you to work with on the CDAS site. And one last comment.
So for scientific folks, this is probably the preferred site to go. The mobile app is more for, do I want to take my kid to the beach, this beach or that beach today? And some of the other things we're working on NASA with is to get faster turnaround in the future. Instead of the typical 24-hour turnaround from acquisition, can we get it in a couple hours? So maybe you can get same-day data, take a look at your lake, make decisions.
And this is the tool where we developed that Lakeshed, that image I showed you earlier that showed Winnebago and all the different HUCs that contributed to that lake. You can access this directly, not right this second, it's in beta version, but it'll be up, so you'll be able to get those as far as what's contributing to these freshwater systems on a Lakeshed level. Okay? Sure.
Cody replies, thanks, it will be interesting to see what you determine for lakes such as watershed reservoir in northern Idaho.
Northern.
That was in reference to the nutrient water bodies question.
Okay.
And then Angela has a question. What would you consider background levels of cyanobacteria? Cell count of 2,000 cells per milliliter doesn't really cost.
Yeah, I knew someone would catch that. That was probably the slide as far as putting up the cell number, the cell count. I probably could have termed it better, but what we're looking at is a value of 10,000 or more to be our indicator that something's happening in the lake. So that basically allows us to see that there is impairment, whether it's a low, medium, or high. And so, but good question. Is that it? Okay, thank you.